It is my great privilege and honour to welcome you all to the delayed and long overdue memorial to mark and celebrate the extraordinary life and times of Ian Macdonald QC. I am particularly humbled to make this welcome on behalf of Ian's family, his partner Bridget, his sons and stepson, as well as also on behalf of Garden Court Chambers, and I do that as its current chair and one of its heads of chambers. That's a role that Ian had for over 30 years, and it's a role for which we are deeply grateful at Garden Court that he and Owen Davies KC, who's sitting over there, undertook that great burden for such a long time and saw Garden Court change so radically over that period of time. I also welcome you on behalf of Garden Court North, which is the chambers that Ian was a founding member of and its head from its inception until the end of his life. Ian's death on the 19th of November 2019 was met with great shock and deep sadness, as well as a wave of heartfelt tributes of respect, admiration and love for a man who in the 8 decades of his life had achieved so much in so many different ways and to the benefit of so many different people. We knew that in his passing we had lost someone irreplaceable, someone who had somehow seemed invincible, certainly irrepressible, and still, even at 80, there seemed so much still to contribute. There might even have been some time for rest and reflection. Over the course of this evening, we hope to capture some of the very many accomplishments of Ian's long life. His career in the law, at the bar, in law centres and community-based groups, as a committed anti-racist and anti-imperialist, those two aspects underpinning his commitment and involvement in immigration law and practice. He was a campaigner, thinker, advocate, writer and orator. It was a life dedicated to exposing and challenging abuse of state power, discrimination in its many forms, defending civil liberties and fundamental rights, in pursuit of historical, legal, economic and social justice for those within this country and across its former empire in particular, but indeed the world, who were denied it. You will hear first from Ian's family, from his son Ian Macdonald Jr. and from his stepson Callum Bailey. You'll also hear from his school friend and university colleague Lord Hacking, and from his early colleagues at the bar, including Lord Carnworth, who may offer us some insight of the significance of Ian's contribution to the law from his role on the bench. You will also hear from his comrades and fellow campaigners, like Professor Gus John and Alethea Jones-Conte. Alethea is going to appear by Zoom. And you'll also hear from her about Ian's role as the advocate in the Mangrove Nine trial, the case in which Ian first came to prominence as a unique and effective advocate, challenging in one of the first cases, but by no means the last, institutional racism within the Metropolitan Police and the criminal justice system. You will hear from his friends and colleagues in Garden Court, from Leslie Thomas KC, from Francis Webber, who was also one of the editors of at least 2 volumes of Macdonald, and also from Nicholas Blake KC, also a former colleague at Garden Court and a long-standing collaborator on Macdonald. You'll hear from Pete Weatherby, who is the current chair of Garden Court North, and we will also end with words from Linton Kwesi Johnson, poet and friend. I thank them all in advance for agreeing to make their contributions, and it is testament to the high regard that Ian is held that we had far more people wishing to contribute than we could accommodate this evening, and so we hope that you will carry on after the speeches to share your memories, your anecdotes of Ian, the best and the worst bits, to continue our recollections and celebration, and to raise a glass in his honour. Finally, we recognise that it is his family who suffered the profound loss of a partner, father and grandfather. But we hope that through this event of remembrance and celebration, we remind them and all of us that Ian meant so much to so many. By living a life guided by principle and passion for justice, as a radical, with a spirit of rebellion and mischief. Of course, he had frailties, we all do. He was only human, after all. But he did right and feared no one. And moreover, he did that with humour and compassion.
I'm Ian Macdonald, the eldest son. I didn't call my son Ian, and that was a big issue with my dad and I. My eldest son is called Luca, and I remember my dad saying, "Where's the Ian?" and all of this. So he did get the Alexander, which was my dad's middle name. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Those words were very touching. Indeed. I wanted to kind of go ad lib, really. I was thinking about writing something, and it's not really what my father did, and so I wanted to go the way that he always went. I remember my dad was always a big sportsman. My dad always had an amazing appetite as well. He was highly competitive, and as a kid, he showed us all about social justice. I grew up at 2 Garden Court. I was there every week. I was sat on Hood's lap. I got told what's up by Colin. There's just more people here that I haven't seen since I was a kid, and thank you so much. Lord Hacking, unfortunately you didn't get to be with my aunt, but before we were at the 80th birthday party. Went on a date, and she said that I told her that you were there, and she laughed, and it was very touching indeed. I wanted to tell you.
You mentioned Ian, that Ian's father was here, and Ian was here.
I definitely broke the Ian cycle. There was Ians and Ians and Ians. There's grandfather clocks with Ians on. And I definitely closed that one out. But social justice, I remember when I was 8 years old, my dad did not want to put us into private schools. He believed in the state school system strongly. He felt that if he put his kids into private schools, then he wasn't leading by his own principles. And I remember there was an influx of Kurds coming into our neighbourhood, and they went into our school. We also lived at the time in a place where racism was rife in certain of these estates. And I remember going to school, and 2 of my friends were doused in petrol and told, "If you ever go back to this place, we will light a match." I remember my dad said, "Really? I'm going to take care of this." So he went down to the school, he found the parents, and he organised a group of teachers and a group of parents, and we went to this estate, and we publicly brought this situation out, and I tell you, it never happened again, and he was fearless. On the issue of being a dad, he was a great dad. I could always rely on him. I now live in the United States. if I had a situation, he would be on the next flight out. He was phenomenal like that. I want to leave you with something funny. I think my brother Kieran is in here. He'll laugh at this, but he had an appetite. You put a bottle of wine next to him and a huge gâteau cake. He would eat the whole thing and drink the wine and then say, is there any more there? My cousin Alan on sport, he was highly competitive. My cousin Alan, they would have this annual squash game. And my dad would tell us, he would train for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I don't know if it's true, Alan, but he'd always come back and say, I beat him again. But with that, I wanted to finish things off with my dad found love finally. And it's bittersweet, Bridget, what happened in Australia, because I know he was in his element. He was determined to take that trip. He was acting like a teenager, and what a bittersweet moment. I miss you, Dad, and love to everybody who is here. Thank you so much.
Hello. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Cameron Bailey. I'm Britain's son, which for the last 11 years or so of his life made me Ian's stepson. I'd firstly like to thank everybody for being here today, and I want to thank Garden Court, everybody at Garden Court who's worked hard to make this day finally happen for us all. It's been a long time coming. And I'm sure that you all have uniquely special reasons for being here to commemorate Ian, because he was a very special man. And whether you consider him a close friend or family like me, Ian, Kieran, Jamie, or whether you thought of him as a professional acquaintance or a political ally, it didn't matter. And it really didn't matter, because regardless of how you knew him or how well you knew him, I have not a single doubt that he treated each of you with the same humility, respect and kindness that he showed everyone. A little over 3 years ago, at Ian's funeral, less than a month before my 19th birthday, I'd just finished my first term at York University. As Brexit was being finalised, and before anybody else at the WHO had ever heard of coronavirus, I stood in front of many of you and spoke about Ian, of his precious qualities and his less precious qualities, but also the amazing impact he's had on my life and the lives of many other people, and of his loving relationship with my mum, which, as Ian said, was happy ending to happy life, I'd say. For anybody who couldn't make it 3 years ago to the funeral, or who, like me, remembers that solemn day as something of a blur, equally heartwarming and heart-wrenching, I'll be more than happy to reminisce with any of you after the memorial service. No doubt many of you will have heard, perhaps multiple times, Ian's retellings of the many tales of his eventful life. I could talk of his misadventures at school or university, or his travels over the world, his tales from the bar, or his drunk antics on family holidays. But I just thought instead I'd share a few cherished memories of the man we all knew and loved. My first ever encounter with Ian is less a memory of mine and more my recollection of his version of events. It was one summer's evening when I was around 5 years old, and my mum, Ian and Mark George were working together on a domestic terrorism case. Many of you will have known Mark and sadly mourned him as well in recent weeks. We were around our house in Stockport, and the two senior barristers had come over for dinner, and we were outside together in the garden. Ian recalled that a young blonde lad, who he had only just met a few hours prior, came up to him and offered him a bright yellow flower to smell. He drew the length forward to give the flower a sniff, when all of a sudden a load of water squirted out of the flower's centre right into his face. I imagine I couldn't contain myself with laughter. Ian had of course known that the plastic toy wasn't a flower, but he went along with a little prank regardless. He recounted admiring the confidence of this young rascal for pulling such a trick on a man who he'd only just met. But looking back, I don't think it was all down to confidence. I think that even at such a young age I recognised something in Ian, a warmth or a kindness, a certain friendliness or a certain joviality, whatever. Something which told me that I could pull off this prank and that he'd get it, that it would be funny and that there would be no hard feelings. It would be okay. And my instinct was right. Ian was the least disagreeable man you could meet, and he of course knew better than most what lads that age like to get up to, having raised 3 already by the time we met. If it was any kind of confidence that gave me the sense of security enough to pull such a trick on Ian, having just met him, I think it was my confidence in his good nature more than it was confidence in myself. Speaking of confidence, I think it's fair to say that Ian had his fair share. I'd wager that when the majority of you here today met Ian for the first time, it was he who struck up the conversation. He would always, anywhere, start chatting to anyone about anything without discrimination. Though sometimes this could feel a tad embarrassing, it was actually an admirable habit of his, and one that I always recognised in spite of any embarrassment. In the lift, in a queue, on a train, in a hotel lobby, wherever he was, he loved more than anybody to just talk with people. I think in a world where more of us was putting our headphones as soon as we leave the house and retreat into our own solitude, we could all take a leaf out of his book and just talk to each other more. But yeah, to do so does take some initial confidence, and Ian had plenty. You can't be married 4 times without some level of confidence. My mum and I like to teasingly call this public school confidence due to his time at boarding schools. But thankfully he didn't share the politics of public school boys like those currently in cabinet. His confidence manifested itself in many ways. He undoubtedly knew a lot of things, he was very bright, he lived a life, and he never ceased studying. But there was also much he didn't know, paired with a strong sense of confidence that was sometimes a dangerous thing. For example, one time when we were on a family holiday in Turkey, it was scorching and we set off for a day at the beach, parked nearby because Ian had skimmed a foreign map and declared that he devised a shortcut. We set off from the car park in the direction of the sea, and falteringly, only to realise after what certainly felt like a little walk from that the sea was, in fact, just on the other side of a mountain, or at least a very large hill. Ian's shortcut, announced with such self-belief, didn't account for this very large, very rocky hill. We had to trek all the way back to the car, which probably had lost any trace of air conditioning by this point, and reroute. I think it's safe to say that my mum was livid that day at Ian's confidence, but it was difficult to stay in the room for very long. Many of you will probably have known Ian in fairly serious capacities. His legal career and political advocacy meant very much to him, and they were no laughing matter. I don't need to go into too many details about his achievements inside and out of the courtroom. I think many people here today will do that. And even if I did, I probably would not do him justice, if you'll pardon the pun. I do hope, however, that in whichever capacity you knew Ian, you all look back as fondly as I do on the not-so-serious side of his personality. He had a great sense of humour, though his rhymes were terrible, and he didn't take himself too seriously. I think that is the mark of someone who is truly secure in themselves and their beliefs. At a time when generations of insecure men are being told to believe, by certain characters I don't being worthy of naming here today, that the only way to prove yourself as a man is to adopt the most toxic form of reactionary masculinity imaginable, I think that Ian once again offered us a shining example of how to be a better man, a better person. To be serious when dealing with serious issues and believe in your principles, but for the sake of us all, take a break, have a laugh, and don't take yourself so bloody seriously. I want to offer you an image of my favourite memory of Ian doing just that. It was again on a family holiday in Turkey, not perhaps the same trip, and me and my friend Dom had been going on with his dad and Ian to have a race in the pool on 2 pool floats. One was a blow-up model jet ski, the other was Nelly, the inflatable elephant. Neither was easy to mount successfully, let alone race at speed, and Ian was at least 70, with a dodgy tennis wrist and 2 prosthetic joints. Regardless of all this, they agreed to have a race solely for our entertainment. But Ian wasn't satisfied with just racing Nelly, he wanted spectacle. So when the time came, he emerged from the villa wearing a wide-brimmed sombrero, his swimming trunks, and some sort of rug wrapped around him like a poncho. Thus the comedy action duo, Nelly and the Bandito, was born, and it was a sight to behold. We tried to find the picture, but sadly, couldn't. I couldn't tell you who won the race, but we certainly got our entertainment. He was far less serious a man personally than he was professionally, and I'm sure he showed many of you that hilarious side of his. I hope you remember it fondly as I do. I'd like to go on, but there's plenty more speeches to come, and I will happily talk with anyone who wishes to at the end of the service. But I just wanted to finish with my perhaps most treasured memory of Ian. I shared this at his funeral, which some of you may remember, but it would be wrong not to share it again, because it's not a singular memory, but it was something that Ian did every day. I think that's what made it so special. Every day before school, me and my mum would be sat at the table having breakfast, usually waiting for him for at least 10 minutes before he finally joined. But every time he came down to eat with us, without fail, as far as I can remember, he'd enter the kitchen with a great sunrise or a smile, something like this one, and he would greet us with an equal hello or good morning. And his positivity was daily and it knew no bounds, and even on days where I really couldn't be bothered with school, or when my mum had the pre-trial nerves or I had exams on my mind, I think that mindset probably rubbed off at least a little bit on us. So I want to thank you again. I want to thank Ian for everything that he did for me and everybody else here. And I'll leave you with that picture of Ian's huge smile. Thank you.
What a large gathering here, an enormously large gathering. People are sitting not only on the seats, but right on the side aisles. What an amazing gathering for Ian. I'm very honoured to have been asked to speak. I should say who I am. I'm David Hacking, and a friend of Ian for now over 60 years. It was very nice to have the tributes from Ian and from Cameron, and I remember so well of them both speaking at the very sad occasion of Ian's funeral. About the time when I and Ian were at university, there was a young Hollywood actor called James Dean. He was a wild fellow, on and off the screen. Indeed, he killed himself in a car accident, doubtlessly driving most recklessly. I mention James Dean because he became famous for a film entitled A Rebel Without a Cause. He may well have become famous posthumously because I have a feeling that his fatal car accident happened after the film was made, but before it was released on screen. In contrast, Ian was the very opposite. He was a rebel with a cause. It started early. At his prep school, he became a boy. Then he was expelled for being found out of the school grounds against the school rules, and doubtless school rules that he disapproved of. On to public school, which was rugby school, Tom Brown's school days, and the home of Matthew Arnold, who was the Victorian poet, son of the famous headmaster of Rugby School. And he did it all over again. He became head of the school, was then expelled over breaking a school rule concerning the school swimming pool at night. And if this was not enough, to the total despair of his parents, whom I, in the meantime, got to know well, he did it once more at university. He was in the same college as me at Cambridge, and he got rusticated. And I should explain, rustication is sending down from the university for a period of weeks as a punishment, and then you could come back. And the reason why he was rusticated, he was taking part in a raid on one of the girls' colleges. This brings me to another memorable conduct of Ian as a rebel with a cause. He got his friends, including me, to come weekly to his room for a war on want luncheon. To our shame, many of us didn't think about the poor and the needy in our society, but Ian did. So, therefore, we dutifully attended this basic lunch. I think it was no more than bread and possibly a bit of cheese, and we had to hand to Ian a £5 note for attending this lunch, which was a lot of money then, which Ian then put over to charity. I have given you an account of Ian in his earlier days because I believe it moulded him for his future career at the English bar. Others are here to tell you more of those tales. I will just focus on the Mangrove Nine trial in 1970. And in 1970, Ian was a very young member of the bar, and the courage that he showed was all the more marked by the use of the advocate. He acted unconventionally in this trial. He began by trying to challenge every single member of the jury, off the jury. He had a very formidable Old Bailey judge called His Honour Judge Clark, who scared the pants out of most advocates. And I would tell you many stories about him, but this is not the occasion to talk about Old Bailey judges. And Ian stood up to him, and he had a lot of difficult applications to make. Yes, he was a rebel, but he had a cause. But there was a price to pay. He was delayed by 20 or even 25 years from obtaining silk. And indeed, Lord Hailsham, the then Lord Chancellor, had to retire before Ian had the opportunity of being made a silk. And I should explain, a silk is to move you into the realm of a senior council to bear the title of either Queen's Counsel or, as is now the situation, King's Counsel. So it was not until Lord Mackay of Clashfern became Lord Chancellor was Ian accorded the rank of QC, which he should have been accorded much earlier than that. I would add that Lord Mackay of Clashfern was a loyal Scotsman, and he recognised the merit of other Scotsmen, most particularly Ian. He faced another penalty, which is actually in this inn. He only became a bencher here in 2002, when he was past 60 years of age, and the benchers normally are created in their 40s or 50s. And that was another penalty he paid for being a rebel with a cause. I will end up with a PS, if I may, and that is in reference to his sudden and unexpected death. For many years, another raider of the girls' college, an Australian who was also rusticated with Ian, complaining in an Australian way he was being sent out into the bush, although I think Ian's family had him to stay during the period of the rustication. and his name was Peter Hone, and he'd been asking Ian for years to come on this visit to Australia. And so it happened with Ian and Bridget in the autumn of 2019, and after a very happy and successful visit, as we all know, Ian suddenly collapsed and died. Ian uses a lovely expression that in this holiday that he was a teenager again, and I did have heard that from Peter Hone, with whom I remain in contact. I finally have to say, after 60 years, Ian died over 2 years ago, but I still miss him much.
Everyone is crying out for peace. None is crying out for justice. I don't want no peace. I want equal rights and justice. This could have been the mantra of the brother we are honoring today, Ian Macdonald. Ian spent his life organizing and pursuing the purpose for which he was born. I knew Ian first in Islington when he became part of the radical movement for decent housing. And he lived not too far from me in Islington. And at that time, all of us, hands on deck, were fighting for decent housing for working class people in the community. At that time, Islington was in danger of being gentrified, and the working class were being pushed out of the borders. Again, Ian Macdonald rose up in strength during the time when we in Notting Hill Gate, in Ladbroke Grove, were fighting for justice for the Mangrove restaurant. It was a challenge for Black people in that time to have any activity that didn't become a focus for destruction by the police. The Mangrove restaurant was a place where Black people gathered and were carrying out all the normal activities of people who live in a society. It was a restaurant which was popular not only with the local community, it was popular with people from outside of the community. Actors and actresses coming from the West End would pop into the Mangrove restaurant. It was a threat because the decisions by the police to decide who and when and where that people should gather without the permission of the police was a big challenge. Frank Critchlow was a restaurant owner who was popular. His food was good. People used to come to the restaurant to enjoy the ambience of the place. And under threat from the police, it was thought that Frank should be compliant with whatever they demanded. And Frank resisted. And that led to a sense in the community that if we were to be normal citizens in Britain, we had to stand up for our rights. We had to stand up and say, we have the right to be here, to live in peace, to enjoy ourselves, to enjoy our circumstances. And because of that, we decided that any threat to the mangrove should be met with some kind of challenge. And that challenge took the form of a demonstration in Ladbroke Grove at that particular time. The demonstration went around the community to all the different areas that were of concern. The police accompanied the demonstration around the community. The demonstration was peaceful, hands off the mangrove, Black Power, People's Power, and so on. All the slogans that reflected people's concerns at the time. The demonstration was broken up deliberately and many people were arrested. that led to the famous case that was held in the Old Bailey against 9 of the people who were on the demonstration at the time. This is where Ian Macdonald enters the stage in our lives as Black people who were fighting for the right to behave and to live as normal citizens in Britain. And the ridiculous part of it was that a demonstration in a local community, Notting Hill, which had about not more than 400 people, should attract the wrath of the state, that people arrested on that demonstration were brought to the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey is one of the highest courts in Britain where the highest criminals are prosecuted. And a demonstration in Ladbroke Grove for the right to live in peace, to attend our restaurants in peace, was not the venue to which such a demonstration should attract attention of the police so that we should be presented to the Old Bailey as criminals. And I think that was a turning point in the history of Black people in England, where there were people concerned for that equity that this society represented. And Ian Macdonald was one of the persons who was concerned for that equity and stood up with us in court as a lawyer speaking on behalf of some of the defendants. And one of the remarkable things about Ian is that he didn't just stick to the allegations and the counter allegations. What Ian did, he looked at the history of Britain. He looked at the history of working class people in Britain. He looked at the responses that those struggles elicited. And in particular, he turned his attention to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is effectively the Bill of Rights for the population, the Bill of Rights for the working class, the Bill of Rights for the lowest levels in the society, as well as for the highest levels in the society. The Bill of Rights, which says we are all created equal. And when we got into court and the charges against us were varied, Ian Macdonald had the wit and the wisdom to invoke the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta invites the society to have and show equity to all sections of the population. And the section of the population that had come under attack in this particular instance was the African Caribbean people whose restaurant had come under attack and come under a kind of abuse which was unprecedented. And Ian Macdonald tackled this problem head on. And he said that all of the people in this society are covered by the rights declared by the Magna Carta. And it is interesting that when that trial was over and there was a meeting in central London in French Hall, the knowledge, the wisdom, the understanding that Ian Macdonald demonstrated by claiming the Magna Carta as a valuable history lesson for all people who live in Britain and who come under egregious attack by the state. And the Magna Carta on that night was cited as the Bill of Rights for anyone seeking justice in Britain. So even though it is said that we do not have a law in the same way that we have the laws in the United States which give people rights, we have the Magna Carta, and Ian Macdonald brought it to the fore on behalf of those people who are struggling against the injustices meted out to us by a clique of police officers in Notting Hill Gate. I think that we need to look at the example of Ian Macdonald, the way he approached the situation. He did not just go under on the attack against the behavior of the police. What he did was to demonstrate to the population, the working class population, the population who came up against the abuses of some sections of the police, and say, these are our rights. They are cited, they are written, they are available for all of us, and we should use them. And in that sense, we honor the memory of Ian Macdonald, who made it available to us to know what our legal rights are, written in the Magna Carta of the United Kingdom. What you said? Yeah. I would like to express my thanks to all the persons who organized this glorious meeting and who gave me the privilege of addressing you on behalf of those of us who had come under assault in Britain by the police and who, in the words of Ian Macdonald, were rescued by the Magna Carta. Thank you.
I want to thank Bridget and Ian and Kieran, Garden Court Chambers, Colin Cook, for the privilege of being able to share some thoughts with you. Some of you will remember that I conducted Ian's funeral, at which many more would have loved to be able to be present. I met Ian when I joined CARD, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination, as a 22-year-old in 1967. He and I struck up a friendship, and we soon discovered that not everybody in CARD was on the same side of the barricades as ourselves. He had a major, as we've heard, passionate commitment to racial equality and social justice, and above all, a passion for human liberation. And as someone who had been doing theology and gave that up as a bad job and embraced Marxism, he and I spoke a lot about the role of the established church in enslavement, in the endorsement of what totalitarian tyrants were doing in Latin America and other parts of the world. So he was an internationalist in his passion for social justice and for human liberation. A year or so later, as a youth worker in Ladbroke Grove, Ian supported us as youth workers, working in the Metro Youth Club and in a delightful little place called the Cryptic One Youth Club in the crypt of St. Michael's Church in Paddington. That was before the Mangrove demonstration that Althea has just reminded us about. Tyranny from the police. So that by the time the Mangrove demonstration took place, there had been widespread knowledge and indeed condemnation in that area, and not only in that community but across London, for what the police were actually doing, particularly to black young people in that area. That led to Ian, myself, Peter Candler, John O'Malley and others starting the first law center, the Notting Hill Law Center, and giving free legal advice to those very youths, to their parents, to people suffering from housing neglect and many other social disadvantages. It was therefore for me, and indeed some of my comrades who are here tonight, a privilege to have had Ian join our struggles in the Black Parents Movement, with the Race Today Collective, with the Black Youth Movement, as we struggled particularly against police oppression and against the court system that was endorsing the malpractice of the police. Lord Hakim talked about Ian's fearlessness, so did Cameron. That was one of his distinguishing qualities. So when I was with a staff reporter from the Sunday Times, Derek Humphrey, researching a book that we published in 1972, Police Power and Black People, it was a joy to see Ian take on stipendiary magistrates, district judges as they're known, and indeed to challenge them about the fact that they genuinely believed the police, and without hearing all the evidence and determining that those who were defendants were actually guilty. And what I loved about Ian was the glint in his eyes when he took on the judiciary in that way. We, as young men, and indeed many people in the population at the time, were very much in awe of barristers. And some barristers saw themselves as very awesome people. So we were in many ways astonished that that young barrister, with the background that we've heard of, coming from rugby and all of that, with that Scottish parentage, were making common cause with us as ordinary, poor, dispossessed people, both black and white, within those communities. And he brought about a shift in the way we dealt with cases, criminal cases, many times resulting from police abuse, malpractice, and an abuse of the law that they were applying. And we could depend upon Ian to hear the testimonies of those who were being tried, whom had charges brought against them, and to work with the defendants and their campaigns so that justice could be served. He did that fearlessly, but in spite of his excellence and his brilliance in intellect, brilliance as an advocate, he kept his feet firmly on the ground when he wasn't kicking the ass of the establishment. And we admired him for that. He was one among us as people struggling for social justice, building a resistance movement. And I asked him regularly why he didn't become a judge. He could have been a judge many times over. And as far as he was concerned, that was not where he belonged. He belonged amongst us and with our campaigns and our struggles for justice. And the fact that it took so many years before he got silk was not to us at any rate so surprising. Lord Hailsham recklessly pronounced that Ian would get silk over his dead body. And before very long, Hailsham obligingly died. And Ian got silk. So, my friends, I can tell you a whole number of events in which Ian's advocacy and his embracing of our struggles were historical. The Law Center I've mentioned, the 1981 New Cross fire and the coroner's inquest that followed that, the uprisings in Lambeth and Moss Side, etc., later that very year, and the way in which the police were conducting themselves, the work he did encouraging the Honourable Society in Manchester to work with us, and that was even before Garden Court North was formed. We owe him a massive debt. And in acknowledgement of that, I have just written a book called Blazing Trails, Stories of a Heroic Generation. There are 22 chapters in that book, all of them relating to black activists from the Caribbean who made a significant contribution to racial equality and social justice in this society. And there's one more. Not from the Caribbean, from Scotland. That one more is Ian Macdonald, the only white person in that book. And I felt that I owed it to him to include him in that way.
From San Diego, a train in every mining mill, wherever workers organize, there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Macdonald. We go back to the late 60s, early 70s, across the river. The Sun tenements, they're the very biggest and nastiest tenements in South London. And we were dealing with a man named Mark Roscoff, and he claimed that he didn't have tenants, he had lots of these. These were nasty buildings, 6 stories high, sewage running down the stairways. Sewage, raw sewage. The people there, they wanted to get condemned to this matter, and the buildings condemned, they wanted to get them demolished, passed in there, and they wanted to be rehoused. But as they were not tenants, people in County Hall didn't want to know. Well, they found in Macdonald, he dealt with this man up in the East End, he dealt with questions of licenses, not tenants, and he started winning. And in pitched in, and we won battle after battle after battle after battle. First, it was getting the buildings condemned, then it was getting the agreement that they be demolished. And then a long, long succession of battles. I'll refer to them as dominoes. We kept taking the dominoes down. First, it was only families who would be housed. Well, that was easy to win. And then it was women to be housed. That was a victory. Then several men to be housed. That was a victory. And all this came as people were in there before the certification of buildings as unfit. So we had to go through another stage, those who were in after that, and before the agreement to purchase and knock them down. That was another stage. And we had to go in more battles after that, up to when people would actually be getting housing. So one after the other, in and tenants, they're toppling these dominoes down and winning. One of the tactics used at County Hall across the river there, one of the tactics used by the people was the People's Law. This consisted of going into the hall and whenever they approached the hall, these were mainly all Irish people, some didn't know they, but mainly all Irish. Whenever they went here at County Hall, it became the close town hall. But before they started doing that, people got in there and they got into the big rooms, all the tables, all the lawyers' documents, all the county hall documents, and just dump them all. Down. Dump all that stuff over. That's the People's Law. That's the dominoes and all the case files. And that worked. So that was victory was eventually gained for all those people, except single-minded movement after demolition began. But even there, we persevered. We didn't get them rehoused, but we did get the start of a process as housing associations being formed to house those men in houses which had been vacated. So that was a victory as well, and that went on to become the beginnings of some well-known housing associations like Potter. So those conditions, they look across, these victories spread once again. We look across the river, we look downriver to the people's campaigns and doctrines, the joint doctrines action groups. Some of the strength of that came from the organising across the river, behind our High Street, out of the market where horse tenements were. Across the river you can see a symbol of other victories, the Oxford Tower. That's home of the people. Again, the campaigns and spread from around Borough Market up to across the river there. The people did battle there to get hold of the land. It's the same tactics and the county home and pumped over all the orange files, same tricks. And it worked. So they gained 14 acres of land. You look over there at the Oxford Tower. There's 84 social housing flats in that block that belong to the people. There's 5 tenants, housing cooperatives which run all the properties around there. The price of the flat, the rent you pay for the flat over there, is just going to cover the cost of maintaining it. It's huge differences. You might get sort of £200 for a week for a flat compared to something else in the open market. It might be well over £2,000. So that's some of the victories that came from Ian's vital work then. Along these years, we kept meeting up at a place we love very much, and that's Highbury, Carson Stadium. And I've been there also with Kieran and my sons, and I still go there. So we've been doing Arsenal matches up in Liverpool, Arsenal matches up in Manchester. And these are the things that Ian loves very much at Arsenal. Well, I was involved in youth football. So this moves on to the Swedenborg's case. I was involved in youth football in that part of London, and I knew Stephen's friends through football. I knew some of the murders, like Jamie Court, through football. And I remember them saying that, this guy, he's not going to get, he just gets black players. For example, that's Jamie Court speaking. So, I had been in that area already doing a lot of research from the Master of Economics, where I do facilities and teaching, and on the industrial change in that area, and across that area, and then the housing policies to help create community in Bermondsey and Elton, which means to get flats and houses for the sons and daughters of those who are already there, which in the changing population of London means new coming people were kept out, so they become all white areas. So you had the area developed where these young people had these notions, which you've probably heard the nastiest things said in their courses in Stephen Lawrence and Carter, where they were recorded and both by the police, where they felt that they were the ones under siege. Jamie Court and all his friends. Nasty stuff. So I was doing work on that as well. And when the St. Martin's Party came up, I was Stuart Hall and Bernie Massey had a journal called Soundings, and they asked me to report on the whole thing, which I did. One morning in the car, I was approached by one of Pearson's people, that's in charge of the car in Pearson, and told him about a break-in in his office. They knew something happened because files were placed in the wrong angle, and they were very careful. I was told that the file was left at a particular angle each day, and it was over down. They knew something happened. They knew that I had some contacts for people I could put on the case, which I did. They knew I knew Ian. They knew I knew Peter Preston, the editor of The Guardian. They knew I knew Laurie Flynn, who books regarded and who's done many books on police racism and police corruption. He's renowned for that. So they got on the case. And they were able to establish why that happened. At first I thought it was agents of the murderers. They caught some people who done it. No, it was the police who done it. The police were very concerned about what might be said about the police and their institutional racism. So that's all my story about Ian and my relationship with Ian, which went on for many years, and a treasure family, and many treasure memories going to watch the Arsenal. And I can sense there's a legacy. Young lawyers will always fight and organize. Wherever workers fight and organize, you'll find Ian Macdonald. Thank you.
I would like to pay tribute to Ian Macdonald. Ian was a true giant of the bar. Yes, he defended immigrant rights, fought racism throughout his long career. Amidst the heightened racism of the 60s and 70s, we've heard, he stood up fearlessly for the oppressed and the marginalised. He pioneered the work of migrant rights for his advocacy. His book, Macdonald on Immigration Law and Practice, is now in its 10th edition and remains the preeminent textbook on UK immigration law. We know all of that about Ian. But Ian was so much more than all of that. Let me tell you who Ian Macdonald was to me. Ian was my leader. Ian was my teacher. Ian was my confidant. Ian, he was my mentor. But most importantly, Ian was my friend. Now, I know many of you will speak about the many great things that Ian did, but I want to talk to you about Ian from a much narrower perspective. I joined Garden Court Chambers in 1990, knowing very little. I knew hardly anything about the law then. I'd previously spent my first year on my feet as a tenant at Wellington Street. And when Wellington Street Chambers imploded, I was left without a home, and Garden Court opened its doors to me. Ian led the way. He immediately took an interest in me to ensure that I, as a young barrister, felt safe, comfortable. He understood what it was like for me to find myself suddenly without chambers or a home, especially so early in my career. Remember, I was completely unproven, and he knew that Garden Court was taking a chance on me. He took me under his wing. He offered me work on his cases. He didn't have to do that. I couldn't believe the generosity of the man. He had something to offer me. I had nothing to offer him apart from enthusiasm. Remember, this was a stage of my career where I knew so little that my very ignorance scared me. But despite all of this beautiful, kind-hearted soul was always encouraging. There was never a word of discouragement. He led me on several cases in my early days. We did a lot of employment law. I remember Ian introducing me to the great Professor Gus John. at a time when Gus was having a huge discrimination battle. I could not believe the calibre of men that I was trying to assist. But they were always respectful to me. They cared about hearing my voice, despite the fact there was so little I could add. But it was really in the year 2000 when I encountered difficulties of my own in one of my cases. A problem with a juror, a scandal. At a time of vulnerability in my life, I was in the newspapers. I was the subject of gossip at the bar and from the bench. People who I thought were my friends no longer wanted to associate with me. I felt like I was a pariah, an embarrassment. Ian approached me and said, "Leslie, you keep your head up high and don't let the bastards get to you. You are on the right side of justice, and always remember that." With those words of encouragement, and despite the painful process of trying to rehabilitate myself, my name, my reputation, Ian, as my head of chambers, my leader, made it possible for me. He was there for me. I learned a very valuable lesson. A true friend is one who stands by you in your times of difficulties, not just when everyone else is with you. I'm proud to call Ian not just my colleague, but also my friend. Ian, you are loved and you are really missed.
Thank you. My name is Robert Carnworth. I feel it's difficult to follow that very moving tribute because that is a side of Ian which, of course, so many people recognise and is such an important part of who he was. My sort of role here is rather different, I think. I got to know Ian back in 1970. Of course, much later, when I was a judge, doing immigration cases, I became an enormous admirer of this great work. And of course, what that shows is that whatever else Ian was, and his passion for causes, his wonderful sympathy for people and understanding, he was a great lawyer. And that book is a testament to that 10th edition. It was actually completely essential for us on the bench when we were doing immigration cases, and it's marvellous as it's carried on. But I think I'm here just to fill in a bit of his life, which perhaps most people don't know about, which when he was doing things other than those sort of cases, I got to know in 1970 when I joined a chambers called Two Paper Buildings, which was largely concerned with property law and planning. Ian had just collaborated in a book called the Land Commission Act 1967. Now, many of you may not be very familiar with the Land Commission Act 1967. Funnily enough, he did it in collaboration with someone called Dan Kerrigan QC, who was a wonderful member of the Chambers, whose son is here today, and we were discussing that. But I think the Land Commission Act book didn't run into many editions. I think there's only one edition, and it may have been forgotten. But what was important in 1970, I got to know him then, and he was doing that sort of work. But it was about the time, I think, the balance of his work shifted, and we've heard about the Mangrove case. My main memory was the Angry Brigade trial, in which that was a group who were accused of plotting terrorist bomb attacks on prominent politicians. And Ian appeared for, I think, two of the defendants. Now, our chambers was in fact, rather prominent political change. We had no less than 3 Tory ministers, former or current. Our head of chambers was in fact Geoffrey Rippon, who was a member of the Heath government, and was indeed, he negotiated our entry to the common market. He was a remarkable person. But it wasn't a natural fit for someone like Ian, whose politics were rather different. And I remember during the course of the Anglo Brigade trial, there was a list of bomb targets for the Anglo Brigade, and 2 paper buildings was on that list, which rather worried me. But then I was told that in fact there was another list of places that the Anglo Brigade people could go for friendly help and advice, and 2 paper buildings was on that list as well. So I think the 2 sort of evened each other out. And anyway, we became good friends, and although I was very sad to see him move off to he had an academic there in his life, and then he joined the New Garden Court Chambers, and obviously his interests were different. We remained good friends, and it was always an enormous pleasure to see him in court, because he was such a consummate advocate, as well as being a marvellous lawyer. And so he's someone I remember. He's one of the sort of remarkable, during one's life in the law, one's lucky to meet many remarkable and unusual people, but he was certainly up there with the best of them. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Nick Blake. I met Ian in 1976 when he joined what became Garden Court Chambers. It was set up 2 years earlier, and we lived in stone buildings in those days. And between 2 paper buildings, we just heard from Robert, I think he took a time out from advocacy. I think life was quite difficult for him, and he was getting some feedback about his confrontation with judges, both in the Anglo Brigade case and in the Mangrove case. But when he heard that a new set had set up, a young set dedicated to working in all those areas of law you've already heard about, he was up for joining, and soon became our head of chambers. It was in that context that he introduced me to immigration law, and it was through him that I did my first immigration case, and eventually we worked together on this book, Macdonald on Immigration Law and Practice. It was in 1983 that first volume, the grey volume there, was first written. And it was an unusual law book on a topic on which there were no previous books of academic and practitioners' guides had ever been written. It was unusual because every page of it demonstrated his anger with the law that he was describing. He had, because of his deep connections with the Caribbean community in particular, but other communities as well, this sense of lots of the common law right of abode, which had been cut down by successive Commonwealth Immigrant Acts, and then the 1971 Immigration Act had come along. And he was also unhappy with the way that the rules that were brought in to control Commonwealth immigration into the United Kingdom seemed to be targeted at certain sensitive issues, such as the women from the Caribbean who left their children behind to join their parents or to come here for employment, but then finding it difficult to bring their children in 5-10 years later because of the sole responsibility rule. Or the young men from, particularly from Bangladesh, as I recall, who had come as single men and then wanted to bring their wives later on after they'd established themselves, were finding difficulty with the so-called primary purpose rule. And that anger was reflected at the time that this volume came out because there had been the disorders in Brixton that Lord Scarman was investigating, and the causes of those disorders and racial discrimination in particular to the forefront was alive in the public domain, but Ian felt that the immigration appeals people were not picking up this sense of injustice, and so he wrote this book. All of that was summarised in the preface to that book. You will find the phrase, "Thanet House slumbers while Brixton burns." I've tried to set the context. For some of you younger people, I know there's some old people here, but you younger people, Thanet House was where immigration appeals were heard for many years in the 70s, when the Immigration Appeals Act was first came into force and set up opposite the Royal Courts of Justice. Was, I think, once the ABC bakery, but anyway, enough of that. This comment was noted in the first reviews of this book. This was a somewhat unusual phrase to appear in a legal textbook. And I remember when I quoted the book, the first edition, the next time I appeared as an advocate in Thanet House, a rather curmudgeonly judge said, "As far as I'm aware, Mr. Macdonald is not yet dead," referring to the rule that you couldn't quote a legal textbook by a living author. So that was what their response was. But gradually, through a process known as Socratic dialogue, I'm credited in that first edition as saying I always act as the devil's advocate, which I think probably means that we would test out a proposition by debating and arguing until we thought it was correct. We made a contribution to, and the textbook became an absolutely critical part of legal practice, and it was quoted with approval by the High Court Judiciary and the Court of Appeal and so on. Time does not permit an expansion of that very brief summary and how many of those issues and that burning sense of injustice was then reflected in other areas of the law about asylum, European free movement rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and such like. It's a dramatic story that I hope can be developed somewhere, sometime soon, as things move on. But the important thing about the book, and that's my contribution to tonight's discussion, this book as Ian's monument, is that it identified an area of public law previously overlooked by legal education in universities or legal practice in the Inns of Court and the bar. It made immigration and asylum law a coherent area of practice. It led to the foundation of the Immigration Law Practitioners Association, of which Ian then became the first president. He'll be remembered for many things in his career, and you've heard a number of them already this evening. But for me, this work is his monument to his vision, commitment, and courage. It sought to build bastions of principle on the shifting sands of what had been executive policy. Of course, monuments don't always last forever, and immigration and asylum law might be returning to the shifting sands, and the bastions of principle may be undermined by the rising tide in the affairs of men and women that is coming in again. But his courage, his commitment, and his passion for justice will always be remembered.
Hello, I'm Fran Webber, a former colleague and friend and comrade of Ian, whom I met not at what became Garden Court. I met him actually at the Institute of Race Relations, shortly after its transformation from a sort of unofficial branch of Foreign Office almost, which existed to make Africa safe for capitalism, post-colonial. Its transformation in 1972 from that and the management of domestic race relations, from that to what Sivanandan, the man behind the coup at the Institute of Race Relations, called a servicing station for people on their way to liberation, which is wonderful, but it was the 60s, early 70s, remember. Anyway, I met Ian there, and he was at that time in the throes of developing the idea that became Macdonald's Immigration Law and Practice, because he wanted to analyse, as Nick said, the 71 Immigration Act in the whole context of colonial, of an immigration policy which was informed by colonialism and was still colonial. And so he was really the reason why I came to Farrer's Building, as it then was, which then became Garden Court, because he was a pioneer of committed anti-racist practice as a barrister, which was, he was absolutely a pioneer of that. We, at bar school, we were taught that commitment, except to the law itself, that commitment to clients, commitment to causes was anathema. To become a good barrister, you had to be distanced. So Ian broke the rules. He didn't believe in that. He didn't believe in a way, in the law for its own sake. He believed in the law as a tool in the fight for justice. Because we all know, and Nick referred to this, that the sort of laws that are coming in now have nothing to do with justice. So it's very important, I think, to make this distinction between law and justice. And Ian absolutely knew it, down to the soles of his shoes. He knew that distinction. And so for him, and what Althea was saying about the way Ian used the Magna Carta in the Mangrove Nine trial was absolutely spot on, because he used the law against this systemic injustice that he was fighting. So that was a lovely story. So yes, he broke the rules in that way. And he wrote Macdonald. Sorry, we just always call it Macdonald, Immigration Law and Practice. He wrote it, not because he wanted to, it's obvious, he didn't want to write a legal textbook. He wanted to inspire and to educate young lawyers to fight the entrenched injustice that he saw within the immigration system. And in order to fight, obviously you've got to learn, you've got to get in there, learn the rules, learn the law, learn to get the tools of the trade. So that was the purpose of that textbook. And that's the fact that it's become a sort of Bible for Court of Appeal judges, I think is quite amusing. But it's important. It's important that it's Ian's book that has become the Bible for Court of Appeal judges. So that's great. I think pretty well everything else has been said about Ian. How he was a teenager a lot of the time. I mean, that was one of his real endearing qualities, that he stayed forever young. I mean, to the point of dyeing his hair when he was 80 or something. It's not true, I'm being told. So he had this wonderful kind of innocent personal vanity about him, which was so sweet and endearing. And it contrasted totally with this humility that he had, which made him totally approachable. One of my pupils who's here tonight, Tuglu, or Krishnendra Mukherjee, tells this story about when he was a pupil in Chambers, and Ian spotted him on the other side of the road, just walking along, and Ian crossed the road to chat to him and to walk with him. And Tuglu was, absolutely astonished, because there's the sort of head of Chambers crossing the road to talk to this insignificant young pupil. But it's absolutely typical of Ian. So, yes, an absolutely wonderful, a lovely man. Lots of flaws, very human, just a lovely man, but obviously far more than that, and that's what we've been talking about. He should be so proud of his legacy to create a whole, not just one generation, but generations of activist lefty lawyers, the bane of Suella Braverman's life. Just one more thing to say is just we need his courage, his fearlessness now to fight this resurgence of absolute overt blatant racism in policing and in migration policy. It's never been more vital, actually. So yeah, that's my last thing.
Hi, my name's Pete Weatherby. I'm a barrister at Garden Court North Chambers, and I say straight away that it's a hard position to be on the speaker's schedule, because I feel that I hardly knew Ian, apart from Cameron and Ian. I think I've known him for the least time. I only knew Ian since the mid-1980s. In the mid-1990s, I was one of the people who helped Ian establish Garden Court North Chambers in Manchester. Sadly, on Ian's death, I became the only remaining founding member of Garden Court North. One had retired, one had emigrated to Canada, another had emigrated, of all places, to Scotland, and another had gone to jail. Our little mistake, Ian would say. Although once I'd had a whiskey too many and he'd had a brandy too many, I reminded him he'd in fact brought that person into Chambers. A rare mistake. The Garden Court North was a remarkable achievement of Ian, because, as you've heard, having established basically and led Garden Court Chambers in London for a couple of decades, he decided that wasn't quite enough. So he started again. And he did what nobody else had done, or indeed has done since, which is to set up a radical set of barristers' chambers outside of London. And that may not have been his biggest achievement, but I think it was certainly one of his greatest legacies. But then I am a little biased. He was head of Chambers for about 15 years in Manchester, having done more than that in London. And he left the Chambers, which today has something like 35 members in Manchester. In fact, my involvement, as I say, started with Ian a decade at least before that, as a relatively young person then, a local campaigner in Manchester. I'd given evidence to the Macdonald inquiry. Because there's just so much to say about Ian, nobody has really referred to the Macdonald inquiry. For those of you who don't know, I know there are many in the room who do know, Ian was commissioned by Manchester City Council to do an inquiry and report into the racist murder of a 13-year-old at Burnage High School in South Manchester. I gave evidence, as I say, at my first meeting with him. And what I really took away from that, and it's stayed with me since, and I've time over seen it again and again with Ian, was that the way he treated everybody. Everybody was on the same level as him. He may well have been the chair of that inquiry, but even as a young man, I didn't feel overawed by him. The Macdonald inquiry was a bold inquiry. It was an inquiry where Ian went in and he was determined to bring about real change. There was going to be no hand-wringing here and saying how terrible it was, which indeed, of course, it was. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to change things. He wanted to make a point that this desperate tragedy of a child being murdered in a school playground in a racist attack was not only racism, but was also class. Race and class being a feature that Ian looked at so closely. It was so successful as an inquiry that the commissioning council wouldn't publish it. It was down, in fact, to Ian a couple of years later himself who published that report. Subsequently, I went on to become a lawyer, in the process of which, being a paralegal, I'd clerked Ian, and again saw that level playing field that Ian was always on. When I went to Garden Court as a trainee and then progressed in my career, Ian led me, same thing. Subsequently then co-defended in criminal cases, we co-claimed in the High Court. Scary, given Ian's intellect and my rather more limited intellect. But he valued and engaged with all of us that worked with him. And working with him, you always took something away. You always learned something. I'll give you a little anecdote, little story about it, Ian, that I think kind of sums him up for me. We co-defended in what was called the Burnley riot cases, I think in the early noughties. A group of white supremacists had invaded the town. With no police to be seen, the young people in the community had come out and opposed them and resisted. And when the police arrived, it was they, young, predominantly men of Asian heritage, who were arrested and put on trial. They ran a defence of community self-defence. Seeing that there might be some resistance to this from the bench, I suggested to the solicitors that they brought Ian in. It was what turned out to be a pretty good shout. It was at the preliminary hearing. The judge peered over his glasses, having looked at the form, and said, "Community self-defence." What on earth's that? Without blinking, Ian quipped back, "Don't worry, we'll explain it as we go along." The judge was disarmed, he sat back and let us get on with it. Ian, assisted very little by the rest of us, did indeed explain as we went along, and the jury acquitted most of the defendants. That was Ian, always brilliant, but with the occasional touch of genius. A few words, but genius nevertheless. Not only persuasive and clever, but extremely brave as an advocate, taking cases and arguments that others wouldn't. And as we've heard, He was a real radical. No Liberal was Ian. He was a socialist, very much to the left, scathing of much of the Labour Party. He was clear and confident in his politics and willing to discuss with all. But again, as we've heard, he was mischievous and he was fun. He was a great laugh, Ian. He used to rib us all. There's too many stories, I won't go into it. But Ian and Bridget threw great parties, with Cameron of course. Everyone invited, the judge from round the corner, the probation officers from the next street, lawyers, anybody else, family, great parties. Some years ago, many of you will remember, he had a restaurant. Very happily for me, he chose a restaurant 400 metres from where I lived, and therefore we had many a good night there. Ian knew how to work hard, but he also knew how to enjoy life, enjoy it to the max. He was always interested in how the more junior members of Chambers were getting on, always had time for them. Didn't necessarily know their names, but he would go around at social events or at meetings and make sure they were all right. He was fiercely protective. We'll long remember Ian for all the things that we've said of him today, but for those of you who knew him well, all of us, you'll remember his smile, his humour, his warmth, his wit, a colleague, a leader, a trailblazer. To Ian, our dear friend.
Good evening. The African American actor Ozzie Davis described Malcolm X as, quote, our black knight in shining armor. Well, for many of us who were involved in the Black Power movement, Ian was our white knight in shining armor. I read a poem at Ian's funeral, written by his close friend and comrade, John LaRose, and I'm going to recite another one. This one is called Tell Him, and John wrote it for his other lawyer friend, Lennox Pierre in Trinidad. Tell him that his voice still sounds the same on the telephone, that I long to see his face, that I miss him, missed him for a long time. Good friends are rare. Life is short, and friends are gold, more so when we grow old. If you see him, tell him what I look like. Tell him I say, so many stiff mountains to climb, so many drowned in defeat, so many sorrows, so many loves in the early hours, so many parties, so many hollow victories, so many lies, so much courage, so much spirit, such boundless hope in so many voyages of the mind.
So those are all our contributions, and it's been an extraordinary evening. I hope that we've done our best by Ian, and we've shown something of what was an extraordinary man and an extraordinary life. There's still time to have our conversations, and I hope that people will stay at least for some time to do that. We've all celebrated and clapped our speakers,
But if we can have one more round of applause for the great man.